Thanks to everyone for attending. I know everyone's busy, so I appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to join us. I hope you find the webinar helpful. We have me on video to kind of put a name to a face to a voice, and then we'll put me on the back during the presentation so you can focus on the slides, and then we'll bring me back during the Q&A so we can just talk one-on-one or face-to-face. Okay, we have a lot of ground to cover, so let's jump into it. Okay, so before we get into the 5 considerations, I want to take just a minute and talk about my background, Newcastle Research, and our approach, because I think it's important to provide some insight into where these recommendations came from. Whenever I'm sitting in an audience, I always like to understand, particularly when somebody is giving recommendations, I like to understand what the presenter's background is, what experiences they're drawing on, where they got their information. Essentially, I want to know, why should I listen to this person? So I think a bit of background is important for that reason. And it will also provide some insight into how we encourage our customers to think about the selection process, which I think will be valuable for anyone considering changing their HR platform. So Newcastle Research is a research and advisory firm focused on the human capital management market. Simply put, we help our customers choose the best HR solution for them. My personal background is a mix of research, consulting, and competitive intelligence. I worked in IT consulting for a number of years and then for a major HCM provider for close to a decade, primarily in competitive intelligence. So my job was to know all the HCM providers in this market inside out, their strengths, their weaknesses, why customers choose them, why they don't choose them. And now with Newcastle Research, I put that experience and knowledge to work for my customers to find the best solution for them. So in order to help customers find the right solution, we need to have a thorough understanding of the options available to customers, right? Makes sense? So we regularly sit through demos and conduct interviews with leading HCM vendors and their partners to review new products and services. And to be clear, the companies you see here on the screen shouldn't be interpreted as a recommendation or endorsement. I have them here simply for illustrative purposes to give you an idea of the companies that we follow. But understanding the market and the options available to customers is only half of the equation. The other half is understanding the customers. And I'm talking about customers in general here. Obviously at Newcastle Research, we need to understand the customer that we're working with to find the right solution, their needs, their wish list for a system, their business. But what I'm talking about here, the other side of the equation, in addition to understanding the HCM providers and their solutions, is understanding the customer in general, right? We need to understand the customers who are happy with their HR software platform. We need to understand the customers who are unhappy, right? Because we want to learn from their mistakes. But the most important thing to understand are those happy customers, right? How did those happy customers get there? How did that organization find the right HR solution for them? That's the key. So one approach is to find a company with a successful HR technology strategy and simply use the same HR software provider that they use. But that it doesn't always work because every company is different, right? So a hospital is very different entity than a fast food restaurant chain, which is very different than a trucking company, right? So a better strategy to really get to the bottom of why some HR technology approaches succeed and others fail is to work backwards to understand the process that the company used to achieve that success, right? What questions did they ask during their selection process? What did they understand about the implementation before the project kicked off? What did they consider at each stage of the process from selection to go live? So if you find enough companies and talk to enough companies with successful HR strategies and work backwards to understand how each of those companies achieved that success, you start to notice patterns, right? You start to notice that the things they considered along the path to that success are often the same. And that's what we're covering today. So these are 5 of those things, 5 of those considerations. And just to be clear, these are not the only 5 things. We don't have time to cover everything, but so they're not the only 5 things you should consider, but they're important. And together, they're going to significantly increase your chance of finding an HCM vendor that you're going to be happy with. And one quick note before we get into it, I'm going to cover a lot of ground today because I want it to be as valuable as possible for you. But if there's a topic you want to dive deeper on, my contact information will be at the end of the presentation, and I invite any of you to reach out if you want to continue the conversation. Newcastle Research doesn't charge for anything for these follow-up calls because they're mutually beneficial, right? It's free advice for you, and it's always valuable for me to understand what companies are thinking about as they consider an HR software change, regardless of where you are in that process. So I'm always happy to chat with customers. All right, let's jump in. Consideration number 5, what's the right vehicle for your company? So before I get too far into the slide, let me define what I mean by vehicle. I'm not talking about a particular HCM provider. I'm talking about the model. So PEO versus complete HR outsourcing versus cloud-based HCM software platform that your employees use. So I'm guessing, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because I'm guessing 90% of you on the call today are going to end up with a cloud-based HCM solution. So you've already settled on a vehicle, and the rest of the presentation is squarely focused on that vehicle. But I see a situation often enough that it's worth covering because I think companies really do themselves a disservice if they don't end up comparing similar vehicles. So I use a car analogy a lot because shopping for a vehicle is something that most people can relate to. The bottom line is this: if your final decision is between three completely different types of vehicles, the search didn't appropriately reflect your needs. So every once in a while, and I could probably point to two or three within the past 3 to 6 months. I'll talk with a customer who has narrowed down their search to a few different options, and they're feeling pretty good about their search, but they've narrowed it down to three completely different vehicles, right? So they might have a PEO in the mix, and they might have a cloud-based HCM option and a fully outsourced option. And so my point here is that there's a time and place for all of those vehicles, right? Just like the vehicles pictured on the slide. We've got a Tesla, a Ducati, Land Rover. They're all great vehicles, but they were designed to do very different things, right? So similarly, a PEO, HRO, and a cloud-based HCM software platform are three very different paths for your company. So you might be asking, well, what's wrong with considering different vehicles? Nothing at all. That's not my point. By all means, consider them, right? Do your homework, and I can help customers do that. I'm not suggesting all these different vehicles are not worthy of consideration, but ultimately what I recommend is picking a vehicle and then comparing different offerings within that category of vehicle. Because if you don't, and you get to the end of the process and you're comparing different types of vehicles, your process wasn't designed to find the best option within that category that makes the most sense for you. So decide on a type of HR vehicle. That allows for an apples to apples comparison, and you're much more likely to end up with a solution that you're going to be happy with. As I said, for the vast majority of you on the call today, I think that's probably going to be a cloud-based HCM. So that's where I focus the rest of the recommendations today. Okay, so we have a few poll questions scattered throughout the presentation for two reasons. One, if I put myself in your shoes, I think it's interesting for all of you to see what others are thinking about who might be in the same shoes. And two, it helps me understand what you're thinking about, so then I can tailor the rest of the talk to you. So Alan, you want to take it away?
That's right. Just as we talked about at the top, HCI members, we're looking to see what is your biggest pain point today with your current HCM solution. And so if you just go over to the right-hand side of your screen and click on that polling widget, you will be able to see the options here, whether it's dissatisfaction with customer service, mission functionality, any of these. We will get your answer in there, and then we will take a look at the results. So Ben, if you wouldn't mind swapping over to the results here. Oh, great. We've got some people already responding in here. Right now it's a bit of a three-way tie between A, B, and C, with E a distant third, but we're seeing some movement there. What does this say to you, Patrick? Is this similar to what you normally see, where these are kind of the top three, or what's your thought on this?
Yeah, it is, and I don't want to. I hesitate to say because I don't want to influence the results. Sure. But yeah, I mean, the reason that we have these five up here is because those are all popular ones. But yeah, those are typically the top three. It's once you get into the kind of a later phase, people start talking about ROI and so forth.
It seems like missing functionality is moving into the top slot here, but still very strong with not easy to use. I guess missing functionality and not easy to use can sometimes be interrelated with software systems, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, definitely. I am actually a little surprised. Typically we see in my conversation, dissatisfaction with customer service is typically the number one, but it's not unusual.
Yeah. All right, excellent. Well, we will keep an eye on that, and we'll be looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say with all the other poll questions that we have lined up for you. But Patrick, I'll turn it back over to you and let you keep rolling.
All right, perfect. Thanks, Al. So consideration number 4, single HCM versus integrated HCM. So this is a topic that comes up a lot. And the first thing to understand is that HCM providers will use terms like single, unified, integrated, best of breed, and seamless to describe the solution. And those, the thing I want, one of the takeaways from this slide that I want the attendees to take home is that those terms will mean very different things at different vendors, right? So the way I have, so you can talk to one and they'll say, oh, is it, you can ask them, oh, do you have a single database? And they'll come at you with like, oh, it's seamless. Oh, okay, well, that's not what I asked, right? So understanding what that means is part of understanding, because ultimately you want to understand what you're buying, right? So the way I have it outlined on the slide is how most vendors define it, but it's still important to dig a little deeper when a vendor says that their system is a single system, quote unquote, or integrated. And to be clear, for this discussion, I'm talking about, or this slide, I'm talking about the architecture, not whether the solution is purchased from a single vendor, because there are a lot of solutions out there that aren't really single HCM solutions, even though they're sold by a single vendor. And I'll be discussing reseller scenarios in a couple of minutes. But for now, I'm talking about the architecture. So what's the difference and why does it matter? So a single HCM is built from the ground up. And I apologize for kind of referring to the slide so closely, but it is what it is. A single HCM is built from the ground up on a single code base. So if you think of that as a single database, one employee record integrated at some companies, integrated, again, I don't want to harp on it, but integrated can mean very, very different things. But essentially, it's applications that were developed and built separately and then brought together. So you can have separate databases, different user interfaces, individual modules are updated at the discretion of the partner if those modules are still owned by a separate partner. But as I mentioned partner here, and as I said, I'll be talking about more about the reseller situation in a couple of minutes, but it's important to note that this integrated discussion can apply to acquired solutions as well as those still owned by a third party. So just because a solution is sold under one brand doesn't mean the solution is a single HCM. So integrated solutions can exist because of mergers and acquisitions as well as white label partnerships. So an example, big HCM provider XYZ, right? So they acquire or merge with big HCM provider ABC, and they might spend a lot of time, making it look and feel like one system. And it's not until the user gets in there, and it might take a couple of weeks, and where you say, well, why is this happening? Why when I open up this, does it open up a completely separate window? So there are telltale signs that it is actually on a separate database. And we can cover that more, but that's a good segue into, well, why does it matter? Right? So if things are on a separate database, generally speaking, a single HCM is going to be easier and less costly to maintain. And it's going to have a consistent user interface and experience across the modules, which isn't always the case with an integrated solution. So for example, from a reporting perspective, it's simpler and quicker to create custom reports because the modules are all drawing from the same database. Another benefit is reduction of human error, right? Because you don't have to manually enter data into separate systems, right? So you have a single security management view with a single HCM. So there are a lot of benefits. So every vendor who has a single HCM, this is ultimately the question, right? Every vendor who has a single HCM is going to tell you that it's a must-have. And every vendor who doesn't have one is going to tell you that it's no big deal. And just as an aside, not all vendors are completely forthcoming when prospects start asking about architecture. So the real question is it a must-have? And for me, there are very few must-haves, but this is pretty close to a must-have. To continue with the car analogy, I live in New England, so are all-wheel drive and heated seats a must-have? Technically, no, right? But because of where I live, I have to have a really, really good reason to forego those things. So, and this is something I talk to customers about a lot. It's a balance, right? So ultimately, you want the absolute best architecture. You want that paired with the best features, the best functions, the best customer service at the best price, right? Well, if such an entity existed, if a solution existed, then everyone would be using that one thing, right? There's a reason that there are 300 plus of these HCM providers out there, right? Because it's a balance, right? Some are going to be the best for your budget, right? Some are going to be the absolute cream of the crop in terms of features and functionality. Some are going to have the best architecture. So, but for me, this is pretty far up there in terms of must-haves, right? If you're not going to go with a single HCM, and I could spend an hour just talking about this slide, and I won't because I want to cover a lot of ground, but if I'm going to forgo, and if there's a reason to go to not have a single HCM, there better be a really good reason. Okay. Alan, why don't we give him another poll?
Okay, we do have another poll question, everybody. So now we want to look at what is your company using today for your HCM needs, HR, payroll, time, attendance, getting to look at what kind of system you're working with, multiple HCM vendors, a single HCM vendor, homegrown, professional employer organization. Any of that could be what you're working with. So we will take a little look at the results so far. Okay, great. Okay, looks pretty overwhelming right now. Even though a single HCM vendor is sort of a close second, basically nobody has a. What do you make of this, Patrick? Is this?
Yeah,
similar?
this isn't surprising, and it's funny. I mentioned the growing the HCM providers growing through acquisition because they expand their portfolio of solutions oftentimes by acquiring and merging with other companies. So they kind of built it as they go, and that's how a lot of customers consume this technology as well. So they'll start out, they'll okay, we need a payroll provider, we need an HR provider, and then they say, geez, 2020, we have a ton of people working remote now. We need a learning management system, right? And so they'll add that, they'll tack that on, and the provider they're working with might not have that, right? And so they go out and they just tack something on, and then 5-10 years down the road, all of a sudden they have 10 different systems, which is actually one of the conversations I have a lot with customers, is because they just have grown kind of organically, adding these systems as needed down the road, and then they get into it, and all of a sudden they're like, I don't want 10 systems to manage, right? This is overwhelming. And so that's a lot of times the catalyst for a conversation with someone like me.
Excellent. Yeah. It's easy to get into this situation where you've got way too many things and it. So let's go back to the presentation, and Patrick, we'll turn it back over to you.
All right, perfect. All right, consideration number 3, understanding the implementation plan before signing. So in my opinion, this is one of the most underweighted considerations in my experience. Customers engage with me, and I could be biased because, customers engage with me in Newcastle to help them pick a new HCM vendor. So that means they're not happy with their current one, right? Otherwise, why would they call me? And part of my job is to understand where their pain points are, so I can help them avoid that with their next vendor. As a result, I hear a lot of accounts of where things went wrong. And often that customer vendor, customer HCM provider relationship began to fail before the solution was even kicked off, right? During the implementation, before they were even up and running. I can't tell you how many times or how often I hear some version of the following, right? We were really excited, and then we went into the implementation and it was a disaster, and the relationship, the customer, HCM provider relationship just never recovered. And by the way, this is more prevalent with some companies. I'm very careful during very public webinars like this not to mention any provider names, but that's something I can help customers with, is kind of a behind the scenes view. But you could also do that on your own as well. I encourage customers to look at G2 Crowd, Trust Radius, all of those sites to really comb through what people's experiences were, what other customers' experiences were. So anyway, there's a couple of companies, one in particular, they're all about growing their top line, and they'll say just about anything to get the deal signed, and then it gets thrown to the implementation team, and hopefully the customer doesn't get mad enough to leave. And again, I'm not going to mention them by name, but it's worth noting that sometimes the customer is to blame as well, right? So a successful implementation requires work on both sides. So customers should be ready for that. And the really good HCM providers will be honest about that, and will have a plan so they can show you that they can show you during the sales process before you sign. An actual plan with timelines, milestones, what will be expected from both sides. If you hear any form of, oh yeah, we do this all the time, just trust us, don't worry, we'll figure it out, huge red flag, right? The good HCM providers, the best ones, the ones that really get it and are interested in building long-term relationships, they're going to demonstrate that during the sales process, during the implementation process, and after you're up and running on the software. If you get a sense during any of those phases that the vendor doesn't have your best interest in mind, that's a red flag, right? And there's a convenient shall we say, avoidance of the subject among companies that aren't as strong in implementation because it's beneficial for the sale. Right. So you want a partner who is honest and committed to helping you with the most challenging aspect of making a change. And to be candid, that's the implementation. Okay, consideration number 2, reselling situations. I'm going to spend some time on this one because it really does come up a lot. So just to be clear, a reseller is a company that sells, implements, and supports a solution developed by a separate software company. And that might seem really self-evident and unnecessary for me to have taken the time to define for you, but it's important to start at square one with this discussion because it's important for customers to understand what they're buying. And I mentioned this during the single HCM versus integrated conversation as well, because the reality is that it's incredibly common for a customer to purchase a solution and not know that all or a portion of that solution is developed by a third party. Right? Some solution providers are very transparent about their solution and any reseller components. And I think that's the right approach, to be transparent with customers. But some solution providers rather, go to great lengths to hide that information from customers. And at the risk of sounding like a commercial, it's going to be very difficult for a customer to figure that out without someone like me in their corner. So because you could take a look through all of a provider's marketing material, sit through a sales presentation, even go through a demo, and the use of a third party for a key module is never mentioned, right? You can even look, if you're really diligent, you can even look through the 10K of some public companies and find only a vague reference buried deep within the 10K to a third party, and they almost never mention the partner's name, right? So I'm not excusing them, but the reason some companies hide that information is because there are situations where a reseller situation is less than ideal for the customer. But, and this might come as a surprise to some of you on the call, there are actually situations where I recommend purchasing a solution through a reseller rather than purchasing it directly through the software vendor who developed the product. And I'm going to walk you through the 3 questions on the screen here, so you can figure out, so you can determine for yourself which is which. And I'm going to move from left to right, covering what I'm comfortable with and what's a red flag for each situation or for each question. So the first question you need to ask is what exactly is being resold, right? So there are situations where a reseller is selling, implementing, and supporting a complete solution developed by a third party. So the reseller doesn't actually develop the core solution themselves. The value they add is the service and support and the industry expertise. That model in and of itself, not a red flag for me. There's nothing preventing a reseller in that type of model from offering the same level of service and support as the software developer. And as I mentioned, there are actually cases where I recommend purchasing a solution through a reseller in this model rather than purchasing it directly through the software vendor. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. However, and this brings us to our first red flag, if the provider is a software developer who is reselling a third-party module or modules to round out their own core software offering, that's a red flag because that has to be a multi-database solution. So a couple of slides ago when we were talking about single HCM versus integrated, as I said, sometimes it's difficult to tell. But if you discover that, either by them being transparent or you discover it on your own through the demo, that's a telltale sign. And again, we could spend a half hour just talking about the benefits of a single HCM, but things like reporting, security, ease of use, reduction of manual, human error, data entry. Anyway, huge red flag if a software vendor is selling that. Again, it's a balance, right? There's a lot of vendors out there and they have happy customers, but again, when I work with customers, I always try to lead them down the path of what's ideal, right? And ideally, and I think if they're being honest, any CEO at any software company is going to tell you that, yeah, they would rather have a single HCM, right? It's actually less expensive for them to maintain themselves, right? And then they could put more money into customer service and things like that. They're not going to say that publicly because a lot of them have, multi-database solutions that they've grown, through acquisitions and so forth. But so anyway, the second question, what is the underlying architecture? Obviously, if you didn't get past the first question without a red flag, you've already answered that question. But if you did get through the first question, and the reseller is selling a complete solution, you still need to determine if it's a single unified HCM or if it's an integrated multi-database solution, because a reseller can sell someone else's multi-database solution, right? So if it's not a single unified solution, that's a red flag for all the reasons we discussed a few minutes ago and just now. Put simply, having different parts of a solution on a separate database isn't ideal. The last question is around why the reseller situation exists. Essentially, is it a long-term business strategy for both the software developer and the reseller? If it is, great. But sometimes it's a short-term strategy resulting from a merger or acquisition or a stopgap while the developer rounds out a core offering. Long story short, if it's a short-term strategy, that's a red flag because it means customers are at risk of being thrown a curveball at some point. They may be forced onto a new module. And I'll give you an example. So, we mentioned during the poll, a lot of these HCM providers have grown up kind of organically, right? They entered the market as a payroll provider. And then as customers' needs changed and they wanted HR and payroll and benefits and time and attendance from the same provider, right? So they had to expand their suite of solutions, right? So you can either do that at a high level, not to make it too simplistic, but you can either do that by building that out on your own, or you can acquire or merge, right? And so oftentimes they will partner, they meaning the HCM providers, will partner near term as they build out a homegrown solution. And I always caution customers to be wary of that because they might sign up and then all of a sudden a year later, the HCM provider will have developed their own solution. And then through no fault of their own, the customer has to learn a completely different, there's a completely different learning curve for a new module that they didn't really sign up for. So again, it's a balance, but I always like to make customers aware of kind of what they're in for and understand what they're buying. So I want to elaborate a bit on what I mentioned at the top of the discussion, which is there are actually situations where I recommend purchasing a solution through a reseller rather than purchasing it directly through the software vendor who developed the product. And the underlying concern that I get a lot when I have this conversation, or when I have conversations about resellers, is around product knowledge. Specifically, are you somehow sacrificing quality of service by buying through a reseller? The short answer is no. I think it's a common misconception. The idea that just because a company built the software, that they're necessarily the best ones to service it, doesn't hold a lot of water in my experience. The software companies that have chosen to use the partner distribution channel, those software companies want those partners to succeed, right? So the partners have access to the same information, the same knowledge. There are whole teams of people whose job and compensation is tied to the success of those partners. So the person in charge of that partnership, the VP, for example, they have a sales quota just like a sales VP who's selling direct. So this notion that buying through a reseller is somehow inferior is just not true in my experience. It's also worth noting that some of the larger software developers who use a partner distribution network, in some cases, those partners are used for implementation as well. So even if a customer, quote unquote, buys direct from the developer, it's often implemented by a partner. And to be clear, my point with this slide is not to convince you to go with a reseller. It's to convince you that you shouldn't eliminate them out of hand, right? Is it possible that your overall experience could be better by purchasing directly through the software developer? Yes, absolutely. That can be true. But in some cases, it can actually be better for the customer to go with a reseller. In my experience, who is doing the actual selling isn't what determines the quality of the experience. It shouldn't be what drives the decision. It's more about the solution and the service behind it. Okay, let's go to our last poll.
Absolutely. Saving the best for last, we hope. What is the most important criteria in selecting your next HCM solution? So we've got a lot of options here for features, functionality, price. It's a lot of things that you could be selecting from there. So take another minute, just as before, look in the right-hand side of your screen and pick one of those options. And we will take a look at the results right now as they come in. Okay, a lot of focus on features and functionality. A little less price sensitive, this group. What do you think about that, Patrick?
Yeah, again, I hesitate to chime in as they're filling it out because I don't want to sway them. Let me give them a few seconds.
Oh, we can contaminate the results if we want.
So, well, some right off the bat as it's moving, and this is something I didn't want to create a gotcha, in the presentation, but we'll talk about it more. But what's noteworthy here is that customer service, if you remember, was one of the top three in the running in terms of what customers' pain points are. And yet, when you ask customers, what's the number one criteria for selecting the next solution, as we can see here, and this is exactly what I encounter with most of the customers that I talk with. It's not even on the radar, right? So, and this is a conversation, and I'm going to talk about it on the next slide, but it's worth mentioning here just because the results are up. So how can that be, right? If customer service is one of your top pain points, how is it not even on your radar when you're looking for your next solution? Shouldn't it also be one of the top criteria? So I have this, and I have a theory, and I'll talk about it in the next slide, but that's what really jumps out at me. Yeah, also interesting here was price. Because our ROI, if I remember, we don't have both up in front of us, but if I remember correctly, ROI, wasn't really on the radar with pain point. And I get it, people have a budget, but yeah, the one thing that really jumps out at me is just the complete zero for customer service, where that was a big factor in the pain point.
Yeah, that is interesting, and I guess true. If you think about it too, the way that a lot of those companies are all pitching themselves is they're pitching themselves based on features and integration, ease of use. Some of these other areas, I don't see, just in my casual observations, as many vendors focusing on the customer service aspect in the way that they're pitching it. So maybe that's part of that's feeding.
Yeah, it is there a little bit. I think actually, obviously, because I live and breathe this stuff. I think it's more. It's not that they don't address it. It's that they really all have the same story, right? If you ask any provider, it's going to be part of every HCM provider sales pitch that they're amazing at customer service, right? And, how are you guys at customer service? We're great, right? And so they all. So yeah, to your point, I do think a lot of their kind of marketing message is built around, feature functionality, price, ease of use, all those things. But yeah, to the extent they touch on customer service, it's tough for people to differentiate with that. And it's also tough for customers, and we're going to talk about this in the next slide. It's tough for customers to weed through and figure that one out because it's tougher to quantify, right?
Yeah, when it comes to a feature or something like that, you can kind of see, yes, we do that, or no, we don't do that. Whereas customer service, everybody has customer service. It's difficult, as you say, to quantify that as well. Yeah. All right, well, that's interesting little bit of discussion there. So let's move on to the next one.
So we kind of should have led with the spoiler alert on that last discussion, but consideration number one, why it's probably this is probably why you last vendor. And as I said, the first poll was a little lower on the customer service. Typically, the customers that I work with are a little more unhappy. But the fact that it was at one point in the top three, I forget where it ended up, but it was definitely on the radar. But yeah, not to beat a dead horse, because we talked about it live on the poll, but typically, at least in our experience, it's the number one reason why companies leave their current HCM vendor. But even if it's not number one for you, based on the polling that we did live during this webinar, it's a factor, right? It was one of the top three, and yet it was zero for what you're looking for in the next vendor, and that's fine. The audience today you're not an anomaly, right? You're not alone. Like that's what I experience, every day. And I have a theory that I've developed over the years, and we touched on it when Alan and I were talking the last slide. But and Ben and Alan, you can put me back up on the screen if you haven't already, because I'm just going to be talking to this one. But so the theory is around how difficult it is to quantify, right? So if you're looking at a criteria for your next selection, you're talking about features, you're talking about functionality. Price obviously is very easy to quantify. It's a number. How do you quantify customer service, right? So you want good customer service, you want great customer service, and you might know that you're really unhappy today, but when it comes time to selecting, it's a difficult thing to quantify, right? Because as we talked about in the last slide, every HCM vendor is going to tell you that customer service is their top priority, and oftentimes they're going to put metrics in front of you, like customer satisfaction, promoter score, net promoter scores. There's a bunch of different metrics they can put in front of you, and great. All things being equal, if it's a complete tie and one vendor says they have 95% customer satisfaction, the other says 99 customer satisfaction, then great. Okay, go with the 99. So I'm not dismissing the value of those metrics, the importance of those metrics, but this is something I talk to customers a lot about. You have to look at those metrics for what they are, right? So those metrics were originally designed to be an internal metric to understand, okay, how are we doing as the HCM software provider? How are we doing in terms of customer service, right? Because what do? They poll their customers, right? And so maybe 20% respond. Like, I don't know what you all do when you get a survey, but oftentimes I don't complete it, right? And, even if it's a business that I'm working with, like, Comcast or my electric provider, how's their service? Like, just go away. I don't care, right? I don't care. I care about electricity. I don't care enough to fill out your survey. So my point is they never get 100% response rate on this, which makes sense. If they're really good, maybe they get 40%, so when they tell you, oh, we have 95% customer satisfaction, what they're really telling you, or even 99%, what they're really telling you is that 99% of 40% of our customers that responded to our survey like us a whole lot, right? So I research for a living, so I know a lot of these stats off the top of my head, but the vast majority of customers that are unhappy, they're just going to leave, right? They're not going to bother to fill out a survey. And so my point is that the customer satisfaction number is incomplete. It doesn't capture the entire customer base. So, and this is what I mean by it's tough to quantify. So how do we do that? And this is in some ways, I think, the most important 2 minutes of this entire presentation. So, right, if you are completely flying blind, you in a vacuum, dark room, whatever image metaphor you want to use, if you have to base your selection on one thing, it's customer retention, right? Because that captures their entire customer base. You can't. There's no workaround for that, right? So customer retention is essentially of the customers that were there at the beginning of the year, how many are still there at the end of the year? So they might have added another 10 customers, so the net number has changed, but just of the ones there on, say, January 1st, how many are still there on December 31st? In customer retention, a lot of companies use revenue retention. They take the revenue, the dollars associated with those customers, and they do that. They're slightly different, but they basically both tell the same story. So a lot of times if you ask a vendor for, a provider for their customer retention, what they'll give you is the revenue retention, and that's fine. The reason they're slightly different is because, for example, just mathematically, if you have 10 customers and one of those customers accounts for 50% of your revenue, right? It's a huge customer. If they leave, that's one customer, but it's 50% of your revenue. So you can see why the weighting matters. But for most of these vendors that have thousands of customers, it's going to essentially be the same number. So that for me is the key metric to evaluate the number one consideration, which is customer service. It's really the only way, real true way to get to the heart of it. So the follow-up question, which I know is going to come in the Q&A if I don't answer it now, is, okay, well, what's the number? What's a good number, right? So for me, and I'll give you a little background on this. I just want to check our time, make sure we're okay.
What's up?
For me, I like to see a 95% or above. And the reason for that, and so, well, let me back up. So what I encourage customers to do first when they're evaluating customer retention is to adjust their scale, right? Because a lot of vendors out there will have, say, like a 90% or 92%, and people look at that and they're like, oh, great, that's an A-, right? So that's not bad. The scale is, so once you get down below 90%, like you should view that, in my opinion, as, I want to be careful, my opinion, as an F, right? Because you're not going to find, vendors with a 50%, retention rate. You're not going to, so you're not going to find like a true F in an academic, scale. So the scale is really from, just below 90 up to high 90s. So it's kind of 10 percentage points, right? So that 92%, that 90% really shouldn't be considered like A minus, like, oh, great. Should be considered pretty average, right? And so so that's just some background. Take a sip here. So I don't sound too dry. So that's just some background on how and why, one of the reasons I arrived at the 95% number. So for me, and again, I've been doing this a long time. And so I have, a lot of at bats in terms of, seeing. So I kind of know, intuitively the correlation between that customer retention and the customer service that a vendor typically has. So 95%, there's a certain percentage of customers that will leave every year, and there's nothing that the vendor can do about it, right? So, vendor A, HCM provider A has a customer, HCM provider B has a customer, and those two customers merge, right? One of those HCM providers is going to lose a customer, right? Because those two merged customers are going to consolidate, right? One is not going to stay on this vendor, and the other half of the employee base is going to stay on this one. They're going to merge, right? And so there's nothing that either of those vendors could do to control that. I mean, they can try to win, the other half of the business, but one of them is going to lose. And there was nothing. They might have been very, very happy before then. So mergers happen, acquisitions happen, right? So CEO hires a new CFO, and that CFO's brother works at a vendor, right? I guess next time around, that vendor's going to lose, right? Or that vendor's going to win, rather. So a lot of things are out of their control, and so a certain percentage of that, customer retention or customer attrition, if you're looking at the inverse, can be explained away, right? And in my experience, once you get down below 95%, and again, remember that scale is kind of just below 90 to just close to 100 if you're in amazing, but with the volume of these big, no one's at 100, right? Because of all the things we just talked about. Keep in mind, once you get down below 95, you're into average territory, right? So 95 and above, those are the ones that I typically look to, with my customers. I think that's all I got. Somebody might ask another question about that during the Q&A, but I won't beat a dead horse. Customer retention, probably the number one thing I want to leave you with today. As I said, if you're flying blind and you can only rely on one thing, that's what I like to do. Because customers, I'm just looking at the bullet point there. Customers vote with their dollars, right? So the number one, you can point to customer satisfaction metrics all day, but remember that doesn't capture the whole base. But do customers continue to vote with their dollars and continue to want to pay that vendor? That's the most important thing for me. All right, Al.
All right, everybody. We've already got several questions put in the queue here. But if you have a question and you want to ask Patrick, you can put it in the Q&A box directly below your webcast screen. And also, we'll of course get to as many questions as we can in the time we have remaining. But if we don't get to your question, like you see right there, you can always contact Patrick directly. And also, we will be preserving the Q&A log here. So Patrick and the folks at PayPro will get a chance to look at any questions that we didn't cover in our time together. So I'm going to jump right in here. So I'm going to start just with the first one we got. This one is from Christine, and Christine she's at a 60-person startup. So she's asking, can a single HCM system really be affordable for small businesses?
Yeah, definitely. There, in terms of budget, so there are the short answer is yes. So there are single HCM systems that sell down into that space and would, again, I don't know your budget, right, at a 60-employee company, but given that it's a small company, I'm assuming budget is not unlimited, right? But yeah, there are single HCM systems that cater to SMB and mid-market. There are single HCM systems that cater well up into the enterprise. That said, some of those larger enterprise customers or vendors won't sell to below like 100 employees, so they have cutoffs. But but yeah, no, there are plenty of options for a 60 employee company.
Excellent. Another question here is from Kelly, and Kelly wants to know, have you seen the implementation? How have you seen the implementations go when there is an implementation partner versus just using the vendors team?
It depends, and I know that's, I'm not trying to I'm not trying to dodge the question. It depends on who the partner is, right? So the question I would ask, I'm trying to give you some concrete, useful information rather than just say it depends, right? Because that's a weak answer. So first, it does depend. If that implementation partner has a lot of cycles under their belt and they know the product and they have experience, then great, right? And actually, I know situations where the vendor actually, if they know it's going to be a difficult implementation, sometimes they will call certain partners. Like that's the A team, because they know it so well. And on the flip side, I've seen situations where a vendor's, they're growing. Maybe they entered a new market in terms of maybe geography or even employee size. They're bringing down market for whatever reason, and they're like, "Oh, we can't handle the volume right now. We didn't expect this. Our internal team can't handle this." And so they kind of freak out and they go find some partners to do it. And that's the worst case scenario, right? Because then you have, someone who hasn't really installed the product, right? So it depends. But the question to ask is, if they're going to use a partner, just ask about their experience, right? At that point, I would want to, because if you're looking at HCM providers, you're going to check references, right? So if you're going to use a partner, you want references for that. You want to know how long have they done it? Have they done it before? How many have they done? Can I talk to some of the customers that they plugged in? And the important point here, or that's an important point, but that's, one of the slides asking about the implementation. That's one of the questions to ask is who is going to be plugging this in. Find that out before you sign the deal. And that's a great question and you're ahead of the game, because a lot of customers just sign up and they don't even know who's going to plug them in. They don't know if it's going to be a partner. They never ask, right? So just the fact that you're asking a question, you're ahead of the game. But yeah, that's what I would ask. I would just ask about their experience, ask for reference customers. Good question.
Excellent. Okay, this one comes from Karen or Corinne. I apologize if I apologize for whichever one of those pronunciations is incorrect. What is the downfall of letting the current payroll or financial system drive the determination or selection of an HR system? Our current system is really cumbersome for HR, but non-negotiable, presumably because finance or payroll was the one that got to choose, made the initial decision, and then it just sort of waterfall down from there. What's your thought on that?
So I'm sorry, can you read that again?
Sure. Corinne wants you to talk about the downfalls of letting your current payroll or financial system drive the selection of an HR system.
Okay, so being kind of
already working with vendor A, and then because they also provide an HR system, you end up buying that.
Yeah. So you could do a whole talk on that question. It's a great question. And you're not in the room, so I can't ask for clarification. But so a few things come to mind. One, a few different paths, and being locked into one module, shall we say? So if you have HR, payroll, benefits, time and attendance, talent management, looking out into the market and saying we're not going to move this one, just severely limits your options, right? I mean, that's just math, right? So that's probably down. That's a negative or a con right there, because particularly with payroll, there's a lot of providers that you can't buy a lot of solutions a la carte, right? And so some of these major HCM providers, they won't sell you just time and attendance without payroll. They won't sell you benefits without payroll. They won't sell you, talent without HR, that type of thing. So you're going to be really limited in that regard. Now, that said, the vendors that I like how do I phrase it? The vendors that I have had a lot of success sending customers to, a lot of those will sell a la carte. It's a very customer friendly way to do it, and a lot of them have the architecture to do that. So that's an option. Is to say, okay, and I'm actually working with a customer right now for this. They're in the construction industry, and they have a very construction specific accounting payroll program that they're really kind of married to at this point. And my suggestion to them is, okay, you're looking to add whatever it is, HR times attendance, add a provider who can sell you that standalone, but who also does payroll. So then going forward, if you do decide that you can switch, they'll already be in the door, and then you can get onto a full suite, unified single HCM. So it's about balancing what your needs are today with where you want to go, right? And that sounds too general to be helpful, but if you can get somebody who can get in the door with different modules, and by somebody I mean an HCM provider who's willing to sell a la carte, and then down the road you can get a full suite system, that's great. Otherwise you're kind of going down the path of, obviously, because if you're locked into this one vendor and they don't have the functionality that you want to add, you are by definition heading down a path of a multi-database solution, right? So if you add HR, it's going to be on a separate database because it's going to be a different company. You add talent, different company, different database, and all of a sudden 5 years from now, you're going to have 10 systems like we talked about. So in some cases, it's a must-have, right? Either because of geography or functionality or whatever. And so we work with that. I work with customers around that, and that's part of the due diligence I do with them is to understand what their must-haves are, what their nice-to-haves are. But I do spend a lot of time, is this really a must-have? Do you really, and just making them understand what the ramifications are. And if, given those ramifications, visibility into that, they still want to go down that path, super. Then I'll help them down that path. But it's about educating them about exactly the path they're going down, if that makes sense. That was a really long answer to your question, but hopefully that was helpful.
That's all right. We'll take it. I think there was a lot of information packed in there for the person who asked the question. So we do have a couple more questions, but keep them coming, guys, because like I said, we can save some of them, or you can follow up privately with Patrick after the webcast, of course. So this one comes from, Corinne says thank you. So you must have done a pretty good job of answering it. So this one comes from Christine again, and Christine wants to know, you kind of got into some of this, but how much weight should we put on the vendor's NPS score? They often brag about that.
Yeah. And again, the same thing. And one thing I thought of on Corinne or Karen's question and then I'll get to this one because I just thought of it. The other thing about being locked into something and who's driving what, because I heard something about finance, if you want to make sure that all the departments are on the same page, because you need buy-in across, right? Because it's particularly the implementation, everyone's going to be using the same system. And so the other danger, the other red flag that I hear in there is if finance wants to keep something, who's driving the process, right? So you should have a group driving that process and make sure that you're all on the same page and make sure everyone agrees with what and by everyone, I mean the departments across the company. Because if not, you're asking for trouble, right? Because then later on, and this is just a kind of cultural thing, later on, if something goes wrong, then you get finance mad at marketing, who's mad at, IT and, so forth. But so that's another angle. Because I don't know what's behind the kind of marriage to that payroll, if it's one department driving that. But anyway, make sure everyone's on the same page. So yeah, the NPS score is important. And as I said, I don't want to dismiss those metrics. They're valuable, right? But I always encourage customers to view them through a realistic lens, right? So NPS, CSAT, all these CRE, all these metrics, they were originally designed to understand, okay, how are we doing as a company? Because it doesn't capture all of your customers. And as I said, that you can Google this and find, I research for a living, but I mean, you could, I'm sure, Google this and come up with some compelling numbers that most of the customers that don't like you, they're just going to leave, right? And so they're not going to fill out that survey first, right? So So there's two issues with all those scores. When they're used as a sales metric, as a sales marketing material. Because it doesn't capture the whole base, right? So really, what you're saying, if they poll their customer base and they get a 20% response rate or a 40% response rate, like let's say they get an amazing response rate and it's 60%, which would be very high. And that NPS score, or like the customer sat score, whatever it is, let's say it's 99%, like 95%, something high. Again, what that means is that 60% of their customers really like them, right? So what about the other 40%, right? You have no visibility into that. And again, that 40% that you don't have visibility into, statistically, there's going to be some unhappy ones, because the unhappy ones are just going to leave, right? And so that's why I really push the customer retention and the revenue retention number, because those are actual customers voting with their dollars year in and year out. And there's no better metric of you can say you like something all day long, right? But unless you're going to keep paying that company, that's what matters, right? So for me, that's been the best, most accurate metric of a lot of things. So again, NPS score, it's fine. All things being equal, if you can't decide and one has a higher NPS score, then super great. But follow-up question is I would ask the provider, ask the vendor is, okay, what percentage of your population does that represent, right? How many people filled out that survey? Just so you get a clean view of, okay, really, what does that mean? Hopefully that's helpful.
Excellent. Well, that is helpful. And that is all the time we have today. So with that, I'm going to take a moment to remind everybody, all the HCI members on the line today, that today's webcast has been approved for HRCI SHRM credit and HCI recertification credit. If you want to get your credits for attending this webcast, they'll soon show up, probably sometime tomorrow, in your My HCI dashboard. Just click on the upper right-hand corner of your screen, click on My HCI dashboard, then Learning, then Download Transcript. You'll get all your information there. And while you're there, don't forget to check out all that hci.org has to offer, more free content, as well as information on our certification and events. And finally, I would like to say one last thank you to our presenter today. Thank you so much, Patrick, and to the good people at PayPro for making it all happen. And I'd also like to thank you, the webcast viewer. Thanks for spending an hour with us. Keep your stick on the ice, stay frosty, and we'll see you next time.